Okay, we were on Harvard.
Okay, I started to tell the story about Williston, and I said that he was not a cocky man. He was a very quiet and likable man, but he did realize always his position in the world. He recognized it as a fact, and it was a fact. They told the story, I don't know whether it was true or not, that he was arguing a case before the Circuit Court of Appeals. That's the court next to the Supreme Court of the United States, but there in Boston, all of them knew him. And he was arguing a case on contracts and never cited a single case as authority. He cited no authority except Williston on contract says this, Williston on contract says that, and he kept repeating what Williston on contract said. Finally, one of the judges leaned over and said, "Mr. Counsel, tell me, is there any other authority on contracts than Williston?" And they said that Sam pulled himself up to his full 5 feet 7 inches and said, "There is no other living authority, Your Honor." And that might have happened. By the way, I mentioned he was 75 years old, and Morgan said he didn't know how long he would be with us, naturally. And he was teaching for 18 years longer, till he was 93. He was working on his treatise till he was 99, I believe it was, and lived to be 103 before he died. But another thing I meant to mention, I spoke about the Jews. We had a number of Jews from the Lower East Side of New York. And I always felt that they got criticized often for really on account of the very finest thing about them. These fellows came up to Harvard, and they didn't know how to behave in a group such as Harvard, and they were obnoxious. There were lots of things wrong with them. But the thing that always impressed me was any of the Gentile boys from down on the lower east side of New York would have been just as bad, but you didn't see any of the Gentile boys in Harvard Law School. They weren't there, and it was because the Jew, so many of them were so tremendously interested in education that they got into a group where they were looked down on. I remember while I was there was one Jewish lady, and she dressed, now I recognize she dressed in the dress of a European peasant, the black dress, and she was poor. She was poor as Job's turkey, and you could tell it to look at her any time she went down the street. And lots of people made fun of her. And yet she was there at Cambridge to see that her 2 boys got through law school. And to me, it's not too surprising that one of her sons today, he has been a professor at the law school for 30 years, and he is recognized as one of the outstanding authorities on international law. And he was the one that he was one of them that the boys liked to laugh at. And it just always seemed to me that they deserved an awful lot of credit rather than being laughed at because they got in a new position. So there were lots of things that we got a kick out of at Harvard. And one thing that I was proud of, and it was quite an experience for me, was that in the moot court, we started off by arguing cases as individuals, and then we argued as pairs. And in the first year, I managed to win all my arguments. And so the next year, I was invited to go on into the moot court for the next year, and went into a law club. And the law clubs were all named for different members of the faculty. And I have a nice little diploma-like thing up on my office wall that says I was in this law club. But it was there that I met Hugh Jones, the the Chief Justice of the Supreme Judicial Court of New York, and Dick Dupree, the son of the president of Procter & Gamble, and several others. And we went as far as the quarterfinals. And whether I should brag about it or not, several members of the faculty who thought that we won there, but we didn't. Justice Reed of the Supreme Court and Justice Quay of the Supreme Judicial Court of Massachusetts and Mr. Winansky, a very hot-shot young New York lawyer, didn't think we won, so we didn't. But through that, I got to know some of the professors much better. Professor Griswold later became the dean of the law school, and later Solicitor General of the United States, became a very good friend of mine on account of that. I remember along in the spring he called me in and asked me where I thought I would like to go, and I told him I thought likely I'd come back to Indiana to practice, and he suggested that he'd like to recommend me for a position with a firm in Kansas City. He said they specialized in taxation, and Griswold taught taxation. Although I did not have him, I had Magruder in taxation, and I told him, I said, well, I think that's about my poorest course is taxation, and I don't think that I'm the boy for that. Oh, John, he said, nobody knows what the law of taxation is going to be 6 months from now. He says, you can do it, but I didn't, and I've never regretted I didn't. At any rate, I was urged to try for one of the New York firms, but I didn't want New York. I wanted Indiana. And I wanted to come back to Wabash, but my dad talked me into going to, he felt I should get some experience somewhere else, so I went to Indianapolis and was fortunate enough to go in with the firm then of Davis, Ponser, Bolt, Zell, and Sparks. And I was with them for a little over a year. The big man in the firm was Kurt Ponser, who's been one of the top lawyers in Indianapolis for many, many years. His son now is quite a hot rock down there. And I think that working under Kurt Ponser in Indianapolis was a wonderful thing for me. I came back to Indianapolis and took the cram course for the bar. I felt that I should do that in order to recognize the difference between Indiana law and other law. And I was fortunate enough to pass the bar without any trouble. Went to work for Kurt in the firm.
What were your financial arrangements on your first job?
I got $125 a month, which wasn't very much. I remember we had $200 to furnish a 6-room, half of a double house. And though things were a great deal cheaper then, it wouldn't go around. And one of the fortunate things was that now George and Bob had both furnished their houses before, but they had some money to do it, so they went out and bought good furniture. But Ruby and I had to go up to the attic and get out such things as those old rope beds and a Jenny Lind bed and old chests of drawers and things like that now are worth a whale of a lot of money, and we love the antiques. We've had them refinished, that sort of thing. But at $125 a month, it was tough going. I remember we rented a room out while we were there in Indianapolis because we, frankly, needed the money. And one thing I've always been very happy about, I think about it now as I read about all the troubles in the school system in Boston. If Tad had been old enough that she had to go to school, I would have left her at home. I would never have sent her to school in Boston because the stories that we heard and things that we saw, the schools were, we had some teachers who lived next door to us the last 2 years. We got well acquainted with them. They told stories of the older children blackmailing the young ones into bringing them money all the time, things of that kind. So I was glad for that. So Tad started school in Indianapolis. She got to be 6. By the way, Tad was a very beautiful little girl, and she drew a lot of attention from people around. I remember one time she drew attention I just assumed she wouldn't have had. We were on the subway, going downtown in Boston and drunk. Thought she was very nice. He came over and picked her up, and I had to take her away from him, and it wasn't too pleasant. By the way, we used to, one of the things that I always got a kick in about a lot of things in Boston. We used to go down to around Faneuil Hall was the Italian market. And the whole area there was, every street was full of push carts with all kinds of things for sale. And the stores had all kinds of things. And what surprised me was the first floor of Faneuil Hall was a market. And I thought that was almost sacrilegious till I discovered that's what it was built for. It was built for a market. And they put the auditorium up on the second floor and the museum on the third floor as an afterthought. But the amazing thing was you could go down there and buy foodstuffs for a quarter to half the price. We bought all our meat down there. We bought all our fruits down there. I remember first time we went down there, Ruby saw a push cart with a bunch of green peppers in it. We were used to paying about a nickel a piece for green peppers at that time. And she went over and told this Italian she'd like to buy 2 of the peppers, and he looked at her and he said, "Lady, dime a dozen." She wound up buying a dozen peppers. We had peppers lying around out there in the refrigerator all winter. She didn't have enough sense to say, "Well, give me a nickel for it."
Yeah.
But we used to get a kick out of that, and then the things that there were to see around Boston, the historic spots. And when we had the car, most of the time we kept it up in the wintertime. We couldn't afford to drive it, but I remember going out, great many things I remember. I remember going out to Concord and seeing the battleground and that bridge with a little stream underneath, the most quiet, peaceful stream. Actually, Concord battleground, one of the most peaceful places I've ever been. It's hard to realize that there was a battle there one time, but we loved that sort of thing. And then over at Wellesley, there was a road that in the fall of the year was the most gorgeous mile drive I know of. We used to go over there when the leaves were in color. We went each Sunday just to drive the mile of Pond Road. As I recall, as you came in on the main road into Wellesley, the roads forked. And in the fork, in the middle of the fork, Wellesley College sat back in there. And you go down either fork about a mile and then go in behind the college on Pond Road. There was a spot where there were 2 small lakes. They call every lake's a pond out there. But there was a place where you went almost like a causeway across these lakes, but the rest of the time, on both sides, on each side, there'd be a stone wall, and the trees would meet above you, and the beautiful colors. It was gorgeous. I always liked New England. It's a beautiful spot. We've been out a couple of times recently just to see it, go through it. But we used to. We went from Wabash to Boston and back in almost every direction, every way that you could go. The furthest north we went was by way of Quebec, and the furthest south we went was by way of Richmond, Virginia, and we covered everything in between. But
Covered them all.
we liked to see things even then, and we enjoyed those very much. Well, that takes us back to Indianapolis. Kurt was a slave driver. He expected you to work awfully hard, and but he never worked anybody half as hard as he worked himself. I was never there on a Sunday afternoon when Kurt wasn't there working. I was never there at night when he wasn't there working. I don't know whether he worked every night, but every night I worked, he did. And one thing I appreciated about Kurt Ponser, he would give you credit. Now, I remember I did a job on something, I don't remember the guy's name. He was the hot shot of Indianapolis at that time. He was the young man on the way up. He was multimillionaire, and a question came up and they had me write a memorandum on the law on a certain matter. And I will never forget the next time that client was in, Kurt called me in, introduced me to him, and he said, "This is Mr. Beauchamp who wrote that for us." And he said, we think it was a beautifully done piece of work. Well, you appreciate that. They had told me that if everything was satisfactory, I would get a good raise at the end of the year. And the end of the year came, and no raise, and I worried about it. I went and asked about it, and they advised me, they said things were happening, and to hold tight, see. What happened was the firm broke up. Poncer went with Barnes, Hickam, and Boyd to form the firm, which is probably still the leading firm in Indianapolis, Barnes, Hickam, Poncer, and Boyd. And he could only take one man in with him. That had to be Fred Anderson and not me, and the others could not. They had to cut down one boy, and so I was it. And Kurt gave me, and I think it was out of his pocket, $700 because he said they hadn't been fair with me. And I'd kind of planned to come up here at the end of the year. Dad talked me into another year anyway, so $700 went a long way toward getting some library, which I badly needed. Well, I came up here then. That was I got here in November of 1940. And Dad's office was over at the back of the old Citizens Bank building. And they fixed another room up back there so that I had my office in with him. I didn't have a secretary. And at that time, you didn't start out in the practice of law and get a great deal immediately. And now that first winter, I managed to make enough to pay the grocery bill and the rent. I rented my home from Dad. He owned the home up at 530 Ferry Street, which was, I always liked the house there. And I managed to pay the rent and the groceries and everything, get by until the 1st of June of 41. And the 1st of June, the court went into vacation. You tried nothing. And for some reason, business stopped, as far as I was concerned, almost entirely. In 3 months, I took in a gross of $50. And I was going crazy. The grocery bill was going up and up and up. And Charlie, out at the Falls Avenue Market, Charlie Huff, I was charging the groceries down there, and if I got a fee, I'd go in and pay him half of it. One day I went in and I said, Charlie, how much do I owe you? He looked at me kind of funny. He said, what do you want to know for? I said, I'm going to pay it. It's getting too big. He said, did you get a fee? And I said, no, I didn't get a fee. He said, where are you going to get the money? I said, I'm going to borrow it from Dad. He said, young man, let me tell you something. You've been going around all summer worrying about what you owe me. He said, you worried about it enough about it. I haven't had to worry a darn bit. He said, don't go and borrow any money from your dad. When that bill gets too big, I'll tell you. I always remembered that. It made me feel that it's not too hard to keep your credit good even if you can't pay the bill. If you just worry about it, why, if you worry about it enough, they don't have to worry about it. But then that fall I got some money, and I'd bought some law books on time, and I had trouble paying them. But the next winter I got by, that was 41 and 2, I got by fairly well, but in that was 41 and 2. It was the February, Ruby had to have her stomach operated, took her up to Mayo's. And that put me behind the 8 ball. But things began to go a little better. We were still just as poor as Job's turkey. But in 42, I ran for prosecutor, and I got nominated, and there was no problem in the election. Ran against Don Moat that spring. It was my first...
that was in the primary?
Yes. Yeah. And that was my first experience running myself in politics. Of course, I always felt that I had a great many advantages. Dad was so well known and so favorably known. I always remembered he told me just before the primary election. I'd worked terribly hard. After the first week, I never felt anything from the waist down. I was walking all the time. My legs became completely numb. But Dad told me, he said, "Now, Johnny," said, "I think you're going to win, but you won't win as big as I did." He had, I think I mentioned that before, he won all but 3 precincts. He tied lost one by 2 votes, I think it was, and one by 3 votes. Well, in a way, I beat him because I lost only 1 precinct, but I lost it by 24 votes. So I guess the old boy, but I always recognized that I would never have won the way I did if it hadn't been for Dad going ahead of me. Frankly, when a guy gets out of law school, he's not such a good attorney.
Yeah. John, let's talk about the judge at the circuit court at that time and the lawyers, some of the lawyers that you recall.
Well, of course, Byron Kennedy was the judge. Byron was elected, I think, he was elected in 34. He was the youngest judge that in the state of Indiana. At the time, I think the youngest who was ever elected. Byron was elected when he was 26 years old. He was a very good judge, very popular judge. He had Mabel Gray. He got Mabel Gray as his reporter. Mabel was quite a bit older. As a matter of fact, Mabel started as a reporter in 1910 when I was 1 year old. And she had held a lot of very fine positions. She'd been court reporter in Seymour. She'd been court reporter up in Lake County in the criminal court, and at Purdue she had been the chief reporter for the, or secretary rather, not reporter, but secretary of the industrial board. She had been the secretary to Will Hayes, the movie czar back there. Mabel Gray was quite a lady, and she was the most capable reporter I have ever known. And I was lucky later that she stayed with me for several years and until she finally thought she had to retire. At that time, I would say the leading attorneys were Frank and Howard Plummer. They were in together, and young Alfred Plummer, the father of young Al today, had come back just a couple of years before, and he was making a good start with them. The Herman Hipskind was the leading criminal lawyer and the leading damage suit lawyer in the town. Herman was an outstanding lawyer. He really was. Now there were things against Herman, and I'll talk about that later too. He was unprincipled. He was not a shyster. A shyster is a lawyer who will steal from his client. And Herman never stole a thing from a client. He charged him plenty, but he never stole anything. But he'd steal a case if he could. He would stop at nothing to win a case. Walter Bent was, Walter would have been about, let's see, that was in 34. He would have been 60 and would have been, he was born in 74, 26 and 34 would be 60. He was 60 and 34, so he was
66 when you got to know him.
Yeah.
As a lawyer.
Yeah, and his son Herb Bent, who's now up at Warsaw, was with him. Gene Wiesner was prosecuting attorney. He was serving. He served his 4th term in from 41 to 43. Quincy Milner was very active in the practice. George Garber did a great deal. He was from Manchester. He'd been a banker in Manchester, worked the bank there for a number of years. He took law by correspondence, but a good correspondence course. And George Garber was a good probate lawyer. He didn't do much except probate. Dave Brooks, I think, had died by shortly before that. Dave, he was a great ditch lawyer here in Wabash. His son Raymond was up at Manchester, and I knew Raymond and his wife Beatrice. I saw Beatrice yesterday. Quincy Milner was active at that time. Bob Smith and his brother George Smith, they were quite different. Bob was a rather handsome fellow, and George was a sort of a bear of a man. They were not the greatest lawyers, but they were competent, run-of-the-mill boys. I see now J.D. Connor, he was just retiring as I came in. He wanted to sell me his library, and frankly, it was a way out of date. I wouldn't have paid him anything for it. Fletcher Payne had been. He was a lawyer, but he never did much with it. I knew Fletcher very well. Played a lot of bridge with him later. George Yopst had been court reporter under Judge Switzer, and I think he put his shingle out. He was what we called a constitutional lawyer. He got in by having 3 people say he was a good moral character. I could have done that too, you know. 36 was the last year you could do it. And I thought of doing it. I could have been admitted to the bar and I wouldn't have had to worry about a bar examination when I got through. But I thought, what the Samuel, if I can't pass the bar examination, I oughtn't to do it.
Are there any lawyers from Manchester or any of the other towns?
Oh, yes. Raymond Brooks was at Manchester, and
Don Mote was at Manchester?
Don Mote was at Manchester. Sarah Kelton Brown and her father, Judge Kelton, I think he died about the time I came here. I remember Judge Kelton, and Sarah became one of the most active lawyers in the county. She did mostly probate work, but she was good.
Were there any lawyers in these other towns like Laketon or LaGrow?
No.
No lawyers?
No.
Was the Bar Association active then, John?
Not particularly, I don't think. We had some meetings. Generally, the thing we met about was to decide what the charges should be. They had a bar schedule, and the bar schedule always, frankly, gravitates against the young lawyer, because if you charge so much an hour, he's going to take a lot longer to find it than the old fellow. You see what I mean? He has to charge more, and so that was about all it meant about it. Wasn't. The Bar Association has never been as active here as one would like. The lawyers are friendly and all that, but it's not as. Rochester for many years had the most friendly bar I've ever been around. They used to go down every morning and have coffee from 8:30 till 9, and they got more work done in that half hour. They get things settled, they get things set. And I've always regretted that the Wabash didn't do that.
Let me turn this tape. What was circuit court like in those days, John? Your first impression as a young lawyer?
Well, of course, the young lawyers in praise of circuit court always is scared to death. I think that's true of everybody. You don't know your way around. The average person wonders what you learned in law school if you didn't learn how to do these simple things, which they didn't teach you in law school, and shouldn't teach you in law school because they're different everywhere you go, and you have to learn them again wherever you are. But I got along very well with Judge Kennedy. Was very kind to me, and I always admired Byron very, very much. And the Plumbers were outstanding men. Gene Wiesner was always kind to me. Another, Nelson Hunter was here when I came back too. I was forgetting him. He was in with Gene. He didn't practice law very long. During the war, he went down to Honeywell's as a personnel man, and then after the war, he went to work for an insurance company as an adjuster. But he was a grandson of Judge Hunter, who was judge from about 1918 to 1924. Well, anyway, I defeated Don Mote.
Before we get on to defeating Don Mote, we had alluded to the fact that you had always wanted to get into the courthouse from your early training. Did you discuss this with Ruby, or did you discuss it with the party chairman? And who was the party chairman? What were the mechanics, and how much support did you get?
I never discussed my desire to be judge with.
Prosecuting attorney, is what we were going to.
Yeah, I never discussed my desire to be judge with anybody. Of course, when I decided to run, I knew enough about politics, and I think it's a thing that lots of people don't realize yet today. The first thing you need to do if you're going to run for public office in a primary is to go to see all of the precinct committeemen and vice committeemen and get acquainted with them and let them know that you're going to run. They can help you a great deal, and it's just crazy not to go out and see them first. As far as the county chairman, at that time, I believe, Goldie Hartman was county chairman, and an interesting thing, I don't believe that I ever made a rough race in the primary when the county chairman was for me. Now, Goldie was a good friend of mine, and always had been, but Don Mote had been a heavy contributor to the party, and Goldie felt that he should support Don, and he did. However, he did not use his position as county chairman to oppose me. He didn't go out and tell the precinct committeeman to oppose me or anything like that. It was all fair and perfect. I had no complaint that he was for Don rather than for me. I think that most of the county precinct committeemen were for me. I went out to see them and talked to them about it and went through it. And then I went from house to house in every town in the county. I got to see a lot of people. I passed out a lot of matches with my name on them, and it worked out. Actually, I won about 2.5 to 1.
Over Don.
Over Don, yes. Then I had no opposition. I don't believe in the fall. If there was any, it was token. I know a couple of times the Prohibition Party ran a candidate, but the Democrats, I don't think I had a Democrat opponent anyway down the line. Anyway, I made that, and in the fall it went quite easily. And I remember so very well, by that time, we had bought the building next to the fire station up here, Dad and Bob and I, and Dad had loaned me the money for it, and by that time I owed him $10,000, which seemed like an awful lot of money.
You must have had an inexhaustible supply of money when you were going to school and everything else.
Well, when you think of a year at the University of Michigan and 3 years at Harvard and buy a third of a building and you only owe $10,000, you've gone pretty doggone cheap.
Yeah.
And we had to go cheap. We were poor, and I think maybe that was one of the best things that ever happened to us. I'd hate to go back and be that poor again, but I think we learned a lot from it. It was worthwhile for us to be poor. Well, when I took office, two things happened. Bang, bang. I had been in office 13 days when Clint Ostheimer was killed, one of our policemen. Clint was an old friend of mine. We had played together as kids out. He lived on the Yankee Road, and I lived just this side of it. He and his twin brother, Charlie. And Clint had been a great football player. He was an all-state end and all-around a fine guy. And Frank Gertner was the chief of police. He called me one night at 3 o'clock in the morning, on the morning of the 13th of January, and said, "John, I think you better come down. They killed one of my boys." And he if you don't think I was scared, you've got another thing coming. It was a rough deal. But I went down and they had the fella. What had happened, he was a parolee who had stolen a car and he was drunk. And Clint Ostheimer and Zeno Malott arrested him for drunk. And thinking he was just a harmless drunk, Clint frisked him for a gun, but he had a gun right in the middle of his pants in front, and Clint never found it. And they got him in the car, and in the dark, he pulled the gun out and shot Clint right through the side of the head and killed him. And he tried to shoot Zeno, and the bullet, the bullet which killed Ostheimer jammed in the gun. You can see it it's up there in the police station. They still have that gun, along with Ostheimer's picture. So I had that, and I had to call a grand jury to indict Mosey Harrell was the guy's name. And while I had the grand jury in, I indicted Herman Hipskin for trying to bribe me. I've never made up my mind whether I was mad that he tried to bribe me or mad that he thought he could buy me for $50. But he offered me $50 if I would recommend a suspended sentence for a client of his who was in a rather lurid case about cleaning chickens up east of Manchester under very unsanitary conditions. And Herman made the mistake, I don't know, of offering me the bribe when Bob was right there. As a matter of fact, he offered it to me, and then I came back and he said something about it when Bob was there, and I worked it so he gave the whole offer. But Frank Plummer represented Herman in that, and we got a special judge. Judge McNagny had just finished as judge at Columbia City, and he was a very fine judge too. But Frank put up an interesting defense. The statute on bribery, you must be offered money to do something to change what you do as a part of your official duties. And Frank made a memorandum and a motion to dismiss on the ground that recommending a suspended sentence, he said, is not a part of the prosecutor's official duties. Now, in these days of plea bargaining, I think that's rather much. And I think I felt then that we could have upset it if we had wanted to appeal the thing, but I'd gotten everything I wanted. I just wanted everybody to know that I wasn't for sale. And you know something? In all the years since, there's only been once I've ever had any offers. That was a lawyer from Centralia, Illinois, that made thinly veiled offers for one evening up there, and I had more fun not understanding what he was talking about. But I haven't been bothered that way very often. By the way, as I came down from when I was sworn in, I walked back to the back of the courtroom. Dad was back there, and he had loaned me all this money on the basis that at some time in the future he would start charging me interest on it, although I didn't pay any interest in the meantime. And as I got back to Dad, he smiled and said, "John, the interest just started." So I paid him off as rapidly as I could, which was pretty rapidly. I always felt a little ashamed in a way because the money I paid back was so much cheaper than the money I had borrowed from him.
Did the prosecutors pay much at that time, and were you able to keep your own practice also?
Yes, I could keep my own practice. The work was not nearly as heavy as it is today. Of course, the prosecutor then didn't have any deputy. He handled everything, and his city court work and it kept him more busy than the circuit court. When I went in, it was paying $1,800 a year. The law was changed. It was raised to $2,200 a year, but we we missed out on the first quarter. So my first year I got 2,100, and the second year 2,200, and it went up all the way from there. And you did keep your own practice, and so that you could. And frankly, it helped you in your own practice to be prosecutor. And,
In what way in those days?
you would get other cases on account of being prosecutor, and you get to be known because of being prosecutor. Funny thing, you'd be surprised how many criminals come when they had legal work and come to you. I thought when I went in that everybody I prosecuted would be mad at me. And yet, generally, very few of them became angry at all. You prosecute them. Now, I found this is true simply because you were prosecuting a man. You didn't have to get mad at him. You didn't have to call him names because you were prosecuting him. You just go ahead and do your job and send him, and he would recognize that you were doing a job, and a great many of them became rather good friends. But we had some interesting people around then. One was Clara Horner. Clara was, I don't know how old Clara was, in her 40s, I expect. And among other professions, she had been a snake charmer in a carnival. And she married a guy here named Horner, lived down around the bend in Hill Street, East Hill Street, down in there in a rattle-trap place. Some said she was part Indian. I don't know whether she was or not. She was a woman she weighed about 160 pounds. She was short and kind of not badly built, and not a bad-looking woman. But she was short, kind of underslung. But it used to embarrass me for a while that whenever Clara would see me, even 2 blocks away, she would shout at the top of her voice, "Hello, John," and wave and say, "Hello, honey." And then I noticed she did that with the president of the bank and the mayor and anybody else she thought had any importance, and so I didn't worry too much about it. But there were lots of stories about Clara. I remember one time she came down to the police department and the fire department and brought a whole raft of fried chicken, and I got invited over there to help eat it. It was good, too. And about a day or so later, we found every one of those chickens was stolen. She had a whole freezer full of stolen chicken out there. But she had a girl who went as her daughter. Clara told me that Sonny, they called her Sonia was her name, that Sonny was not actually her daughter. She was the daughter of one of her friends in the carnival. And Clara said that she went and got the doctor to put the register of the birth with her as the mother. And Sonny told me the same thing. The funny thing, Clara was totally unprincipled. She was no good. And yet Sonny was as nice a girl as you'd want to see. And she worried about her mother and the things she did. And she'd come down and ask the police, "Can't you do something about mother, what she's doing?" But I don't know whether I should put it on tape or not, but maybe you can wipe it off if it shouldn't be. One time Horner sued her for divorce. She came down to my office. Now, she knew I couldn't take her case because then a prosecutor wasn't allowed to. But I think she wanted any free legal advice she could get, I'm quite sure. And also I'm quite sure she wanted a shoulder to cry on. And she sat by my desk, and the tears were streaming down her cheeks as she told me what a good wife she had been to Horner. And she pounded her fist on the desk, and she says, "Honest to Christ, John," she was half-bucked, "honest to Christ, John, since I've been married to that man, I ain't put out once. For money, that is." But we had a lot of characters. Of course, one that was Bruno Kramer was one of our characters. Bruno was he was a drunk. He was an alcoholic, and we didn't know what to do with him, and they don't know yet. But he used to get sent down to the farm every now and then. He used to say that he went down in the spring to plant the potatoes, in the fall to dig them up. And he was one of the problems. Of course, Harry France, you knew Harry. He was always a problem that way. Then we had I can't think what the man's name was. He was running a good race with Bruno for being at the farm the most times. And I never will forget, he went to Indianapolis one winter, and I picked up the paper along during the winter, and on the front page it told how he was found. He'd passed out in an alley and froze to death, and I always felt bad about that. I remember Bruno's first experience I had with him. He was on a 6-month tour down to the farm when I went into office. And when he got out, it seems he got off the bus here, and he'd been out long enough. He'd got plenty to drink. He was drunker than a skunk when he got off the bus, and one of the policemen saw him, and he didn't want to take him on up to jail when he knew he just got out of the farm. So he told Bruno he'd have to go home, and he started down. Bruno had a room down on West Market Street, just west of Carroll. So the officer took him down within a half block of his house, left him there at Carroll Street, told him, "Now, Bruno, you go on home." And Bruno started down that way. The officer went over to Canal Street, started back uptown. They came to Wabash, then north to Market Street, right on the bank corner. Who should he meet but here's Bruno again. Well, then he had to take him up, and so that was
short vacation.
That was the way I got acquainted with Bruno, and I wish we knew now what to do with guys like that. It's one of our great problems. By the way, one thing that taught me a great deal, at that time, Howard Dodge was the head of General Tire. Howard Dodge had come here. He established the General Tire factory here and been the head of it all the time since. And he was a big man in Wabash. And his daughter got married, and I guess there was everything but from gin to champagne and a punch. And people got drunk up there that had never been drunk before. And as a matter of fact, some of them I heard were drunk up there. I'd like to see Josephine and Julia Alexander, two of our oldest old maids. It must have been funny to see them drunk. Well, anyway, Cliff Tuscany and his wife started home from that reception. It was Saturday night, and at that time, Wabash was a Saturday night town. Everybody came into town on Saturday night, and they just walked around and around the main square, and right down about a little more than halfway between the market and canal, it was then the Central Cut Rate, where the bookstore is now. Mr. Tuscany ran into a parked car, and Mrs. Tuscany, people crowded around her. She's where the man drove right out in front of us, and there wasn't anybody in the car, and Cliff got out and he couldn't stand up. Well, of course, he got arrested for driving under the influence. And word got up to Howard Dodge, and Howard had undoubtedly had more than he needed to drink. And he called down, told the police to let Cliff go, and they weren't about to. And I guess he said he was going to come down and see about that. They suggested he might better stay home the way he sounded. Well, anyway, immediately the pressure started. People were talking to me, people that the most influential people in town, people I respected most highly, were saying, you must change that charge to reckless driving and not take away his driver's license. Well, now, darn it, it seems to me, I couldn't help but remember the week before, they said, oh, he's got to have his driver's license to get over there to work. Sometimes they call him at night and he has to get over there. Well, there are taxis he could go. Well, a week before, I had convicted a little tenant farmer 7 miles out in the country of driving under the influence, and he lost his license. And he was in a lot worse shape than Cliff Tuscany ever would. But all this pressure kept coming and coming. And I remember Al Tice was a former state policeman, worked at General Tire, and he was down talking to me about it. I told him, I said, well, Al, it seems to me that either way I go on this, somebody's going to call me a son of a bitch. And if I can say I don't think they're right about that, I'm going to be all right. But if I have to admit they're right, why, it isn't good. Well, I got my back up, and I went ahead and prosecuted Cliff. I had known Cliff. He picked me up a couple of times. Everything I knew had been very friendly. And Cliff came up and pleaded guilty, and he's been one of my very good friends ever since. He never felt bad about it at all. By the way, Mr. Dodge canceled his insurance with Bob, and for about 2 years he wouldn't speak to me. I used to speak to him just for the hell of it. After about 2 years, one day he grunted, and I knew it was about over. But nevertheless, the thing about it was that I found out after it was over that if I'd done anything else, my name would have been mud. I actually got to the place where I felt the public opinion was against me. The public opinion was for letting him go. That's all I ever heard. Nobody came to me and said, John, go ahead and prosecute him. No, I never heard that. But I was listening to a highly vocal minority, and I thought that public opinion was the other way, and I decided not to follow it, and it was fortunate that I didn't. And since then, I've always, as sort of a principle, you make up your mind. Then if you feel that public opinion is against you, if you honestly feel that, then it's time to think it through again. It's time to think it through on the basis I may have been wrong the first time, but think it through very seriously. But if you come to the conclusion you were right the first time, that is the right thing, then say to hell with public opinion and go ahead and do it your way. Do it the way that you think is right. And I think that in the vast majority of cases, public opinion will be for you in the matter if you do what your ideas aren't that different from everybody else. And so that is one of the things I felt I learned back there. Of course, at that time, the city court, the mayor was ex officio the judge, and so I had Homer Showalter as the judge during the first quite a bit of the time, and he used to have court up there in the little office up above the police station. He had a roll top desk. I always remember one gal came home from the wax. They had kicked her out with a dishonorable discharge, so she had to have been awful bad. And she was picked up for something, I don't know what, but she had the largest breasts of any girl of her size I ever saw. She was a slender girl, but these great big breasts. And Homer fined her, and she went over as he was writing it down, and she kind of stood up next to him, and she raised those up and laid one down on his shoulder, and I still kid Homer about that. One of the, now when I first went in, it was Veer Howell was sheriff. I'd known Veer all my life, and Veer I always felt was one of the great law enforcement men in Wabash County. He was, one thing about Veer Howell, he was absolutely fearless. He wasn't afraid of hell or high water, and there were lots of stories about things he had done that were, for example, there was one man with a gun on him threatened to shoot him. He just said, "Give me that gun," and walked right toward him, held his hand out, and the guy looked at him and handed the gun over. But that was the kind of fellow that Veer was. I remember one time we had to go up to Michigan to get a woman with a child stealing charge. She had taken her child and gone off to Michigan to keep from allowing it to go to its father for visitation, which is child stealing. It's a felony. I didn't want to prosecute her for it, but I wanted to bring her back, let the court handle it. And I remember we were told, we got the papers out when we had to go up to Michigan to get her. And we were told that her brother up there said if we came after her, he'd shoot us. Some way or other, that never worried me very much. As a matter of fact, when we got up there, I talked to him. Before it was over, I rode with him up to the county seat to get her. And I found early on that the one who threatened you is not likely to do anything. I remember one during the war. It's almost unbelievable today what an important thing it was to have an apartment. And to be kicked out of an apartment was tremendously serious. Well, this couple had an apartment upstairs. Their landlady lived downstairs, and they had been guilty of terribly disorderly conduct. Anyway, she filed an affidavit against them, and I prosecuted them. They were fined for and then she filed suit to get them out of the apartment, and I handled that. And I never will forget when we got the judgment, the man who was about 6'3" and weighed 200, nice raw bone, muscular gentleman, told me how he would catch me in a back alley someday and would really take care of me. And, you know, I wasn't worried much about that, but he had a wife almost as big as he was, and she sat there and looked at me, and she didn't say a word. And that scared me, because, hell, if he had beaten me up, he'd have quit. But I don't think she would. And so I had some of that back there as prosecutor, too. How's our time?
We're just about out of tape, and I'm going to end this session of October 9th, John.
Sure.
Then, John, I think for this session of October 16th, we'll start with talking about what happened when the man murdered the officer Ostheimer from the Wabash Police Department.
Well, of course, the first thing we did after that was to call a grand jury to listen to the evidence, because you cannot charge a man with murder on an affidavit alone. It has to be by a grand jury indictment. So we called a grand jury, and it wasn't at all difficult to indict the man. Zeno Malott had been right with Ostheimer. He was Zeno and Ostheimer arrested Harrell, and Ostheimer searched him. They put him in the police car with Ostheimer in the back seat with him, and Zeno driving the car. And it was about the top of the Wabash Street Hill when he shot Ostheimer through the head, and he tried to shoot Malott. Fortunately, the shell case jammed the gun, and he tried time and again to shoot Malott and could not. And he jumped out of the car. Malott turned around to try and hold him, and the car sashayed up on the courthouse lawn, up on the hill, and then back down, and I think into a telephone pole. It was stopped there. Malott jumped out and ran after Harrell and caught him. I never will forget the first time I saw Harrell. His face was one complete mass of hamburger. I have never seen a man whose face was so terribly mutilated as his. Zeno Malott said that when he jumped out of the car, he jumped into a telephone pole, and that's what did that to his face. Officially, I believe him. I don't think that anybody could object if Zeno Malott beat him, and beat him very badly. I think anyone under the same circumstance would have done the same thing. But it was not a difficult grand jury. They indicted him right away. We took him into court, and he had no money, of course, and we wanted to appoint an excellent attorney to represent him. There was no attorney in Wabash who would consent to do it, even though they recognized the importance of his having a good attorney. And Don Mote was appointed as his attorney, and he did represent him. And Mote entered a plea of guilty for him, but pleaded for a life sentence and not the chair. I argued for the chair. As best I could, I was too inexperienced to do a very good job of it, I think. I don't know today whether I would have, if I were judge in a case such as that, today or before the Supreme Court decided that we shouldn't have capital punishment, I don't think I would have sentenced Mosey Harrell to be executed. That's always been a question. My own feeling is that it's a mistake to do away with capital punishment entirely, and yet recognizing at the same time that it was used far, far too often. The man who kills, particularly a man who kills his wife or his wife's lover or someone like that in a fit of passion, actually I doubt if it is worthwhile much to even to put them in prison, because those men in almost every case turn out well. They are fully rehabilitated immediately. They're never going to do that again. I suppose you have to do something to discourage that sort of thing, but they are the ones who give murderers a good name. On the other hand, you have men, I've given it quite a bit of thought. You have men like a man a few years ago who insured his mother's life for $50,000 before she got on the plane and put a bomb on the plane and killed her and 42 other people in order that he could collect $50,000. It seems to me with someone of that type, no one is safe around a man of that kind. And in the same way that we kill a mad dog, it seems to me that we shouldn't put prisoners next to that kind of people. Another situation in which I think execution, capital punishment, is fully justified is the one who is in prison and who kills in prison, particularly one who is already under a life sentence in prison or who escapes from prison. We had the situation down in Summitville just less than a month ago, I think, where a man committed a robbery, and he said, I don't have to worry about killing somebody because I am already under a life sentence. And so he went out and he kidnapped the girl and killed her. Now, it seems to me that you always have to have something stronger to threaten people with in order to have any deterrence. And so it seems to me that in a case of that kind, also there should be capital punishment. There are several things of that kind that I think are exceptions to what I would say generally I would oppose capital punishment. At any rate, the man was sentenced to life imprisonment. However, both the judge, who was Herd Hurst of Peru, he was here as Judge Pro Tem. Judge Kennedy had left earlier that year to go to the Navy, and Walter Bent had been appointed as judge while to take his place. And Walter was ill. He had a stroke about that time, which he was ill for several months. And Herd Hurst was judge for a time, and he was judge at Mosey Harrell's hearing. And both Judge Hurst and I put on the commitment that we would oppose parole at any time. And it seems to me that we ought to have some way that we can sentence men to prison and make a life sentence mean a life sentence. When you have 5, as I read about these murders down in Texas, a homosexual who killed a lot of young boys, and he got, I think, 5 99-year sentences, and the newspaper said he would be eligible for parole at the end of 8 years. Seems to me that that is simply a matter of being ridiculous. And at any rate, we put that on Mosey's commitment, and it perhaps had some effect, because he was there for 22 or 3 years before he escaped, and shortly before he escaped, he was applying for parole for several years before that, and I wrote to the parole board and told them I still felt the same way, and the chief of police wrote to them and said the police here felt that he should not be paroled. I always thought it rather ridiculous to have a man, a police killer, as a trustee who went outside the prison, worked outside at a place where there was no supervision, and one day he simply walked off and didn't come back. And 2 or 3 years later, I got a telephone call from him in which he threatened to come up. The obvious threat was that he would kill my wife and myself. And being a very devout coward, I immediately called the police, and they came up, and the place was pretty well fortified that night. But it did strike me that it was, and I wrote a letter to the Commissioner of Corrections saying that it didn't add any to my sense of security, that if Mosey Harrell was captured, they could do no more with him if he had killed my wife and myself than they could do if he had not done that. And it seems to me that we should not have that kind of situation. Well, at any rate, to get back to being prosecutor.
John, before we get off that
Yes.
subject, was there any pressure from the outside or any inflammatory statements from the newspaper or coverage from any of the newspapers?
As to Mosey?
Yes.
No, I think not. It reported it very factually, and there was no stirring up of the populace. Nobody. There was never any threat of any violence about it at all. They recognized that the court would do its duty, and it did, I think. I remember the funeral. It was the largest funeral I think that Wabash ever had. They had it up at the First Methodist Church, and they opened up everything they could open up, and still it overflowed out into the street, and it was an enormous funeral. Of course, police from all over the state were there. But no, there was no talk of violence, nothing incendiary about it. It was Clint Ostheimer was a very popular man. He'd been a great football player, and he played on the great 26 team. He was on the first all-state team as an end. He had married Frank Redding's daughter, Billy. She was popular around town, and the town felt very bad about it, but there was no talk of violence at any time. Mm-hmm. I might mention the thing about it, I don't know whether I mentioned it before or not. The thing about it was that Mosey Harrell was on parole at the time, and he was drunk and he'd stolen a car, and he knew that if he was brought down to the police station that he would go back to prison as a parole violator, and that's why he shot Ostheimer, tried to shoot him a lot in order to avoid going back to prison. That of course was a big one to start with.
I hope so.
I never had another murder case in the time I was prosecutor. Wabash been rather blessed with not having very many of them. I think in the last 35 years we have had 4, and that is in Wabash County. Don't remember which the 4th. I know 3. There was Ostheimer and the Lynn boy who killed his wife, and Cabot who killed his daughter up at Servia, and and Camel killed his wife quite recently. Those 4 are the 4 that we've had in the last 35 years. Very early on as prosecutor, I learned a lesson. I was taught a lesson, and taught it real good. Merritt Sills was the chief reporter at the Plain Dealer, and Merritt Sills, in my opinion, was the finest newspaper man that Wabash ever had. He knew absolutely everything that was going on at all times, and Merritt could be a great help to you, and particularly to a law enforcement officer, and he was a great help to me in many, many ways. Well, I had not been prosecutor very long when Veer Howell, the sheriff, came over one morning and he said, "John, last night I had to do something I hated to do." And I said, "What was that, Veer?" He said, "Wayne Munson was in town last night, and Wayne got drunk and he got disorderly, and I had to arrest him. And I feel awfully bad about it." Well, I could understand that because Wayne Munson and his brother used to have the Overland Garage down on South Miami Street where DeRay is now. And when I was in high school, he was a good friend of mine. He was a good friend of Veer, who was, I think, was a policeman at that time. And I remember once that Veer and I and someone else, I can't remember who, went with one of the Munsons. We got on the train here and went up to Toledo and drove overlands back at 25 miles an hour all the way from Toledo. And so our relationship with Wayne Munson had always been very good. And I said, "Well, he did it, and there's nothing we can do except go ahead." He said, "Well, wouldn't there be some way to keep it out of the paper?" And I said, "Well, Veer, the city court records are public records. The paper could come there and look at them at any time, and I know of no way we could keep it out of the paper." And he said, "Well, supposing we put it in under a different name?" And I said, "Well, Veer, you're signing the affidavit, and any name you want to call him is all right with me. I have nothing to do with that." And so he devised some name, I forget what it was, from Muncie, Indiana. And the gentleman from Muncie, Indiana came up and pleaded guilty and paid his fine and went back to Fort Wayne. And that night the newspaper came out and said, in a headline, yet, "So-and-so of Muncie, Indiana, alias Wayne Munson of Fort Wayne." And it was far worse than if we had not. So I learned that don't kid a good reporter, at least, because he's way ahead of you. And I worked with Merritt for many years, and I had just one theory in working with Merritt Sills: tell him everything, and then if you have some reason you don't want it in the paper, tell him what it is you don't want in, and tell him why you don't want it in. And if you have a good reason, he would always work right with you. If you had, but a good reason wasn't it's a friend of mine, it wasn't that it's an influential person. That wasn't a good reason, and Merritt would be the first to tell you so, I'm quite sure, although I knew better than to present something of that kind. Another lesson that I learned early was that it is not good for law enforcement agencies to be rivals. If you have the sheriff's office and the local police and the state police all working together with the utmost of cooperation, you will have far, far better law enforcement than if each one is trying to get the credit for something. Rather, I don't remember just when it was, but it was early. I had a very interesting case. An old man came and told me the most fantastic story I ever heard. He had his life savings, almost $1,200, and his daughter had kept it for him in a jar down at Peru. And she insisted he should put it in the postal savings and where it'd be safe and draw some interest, and so she brought it to him. And he put it in the breast pocket of his overalls and pinned it there with a safety pin. And he stopped at the post office on the way to work, but it was too early. And when he started home, he went past the post office, and then it was too late. But as he was going home, he met his niece and her husband, and they invited him to go down to Jenny Dye's for a beer. Now, the niece had a record about as long as your arm. She had everything, I don't know, she had been in prison for, I think the worst was perjury and arson, and she had been in prison for theft and prostitution and a few other little things like that. Anyway, the old man went down to Dye's with them, and they had a couple of beers, and then he suggested it was time for him to go home, and his niece invited him out to their house to have supper with them. So he went, and he said that he was standing by the stove, and his niece gave him a sandwich, which he thought at first was peanut butter. When he took a taste of it, it tasted like sulfur, and he was sure it had rat poison in it. Anyway, he spit it out. And the niece came over and threw her arms around him from behind and ripped out the pocket and the money and ran out the door with it, and that was the end of his money. Well, I would not have filed charges against them, except that she had such a bad record that she certainly would have done such a thing. But anyway, we filed the charges, and she and her husband were arrested, and they were over in jail, and Frank Gertner, the chief of police, and the state police questioned them time and again without any success. And one night I came down and I saw Veer and the sheriff and Frank, the chief of police, and I said, I think they're going at it all wrong. They go in there and question the two of them together, and she's never going to tell them anything. She's been around far too long for that, and as long as she doesn't, the husband didn't go to. I said the thing to do is to get the husband alone and see if he can't find something out. And the upshot was that Veer said he'd go with me, and we'd question the husband, and Frank decided he was busy. He'd question all he wanted to question, so we went over. And we questioned him for a long time. And finally, about after 2.5, 3 hours, it was, I don't know, between 10 and 11 o'clock at night, and a very bitterly cold night. He said he didn't know anything about it, but he thought if she got the money, he could find it out there somewhere. So we took him out to the house, and the house had no fire in it. It was way out on Mill Street, right, it's the corner of Mill and I think that's Locust Street, the furthest west street in the city limits. And we went in there, and he looked for the money, and he'd open up a drawer and open it up and look and close it. He didn't really, it was the most half-hearted search I ever saw, and but we let him go, and finally he looked through all the drawers and all through the house, and then he said, I think maybe I'll go out and look outside. So he went out and he looked in the outdoor toilet, and then he went to the kind of a garage or barn building there, and he looked in there, and then he went back in the house and looked, and then he went to that outdoor toilet, and I said, oh, it's there. And he said he thought there was some loose dirt on the floor. It was a dirt floor, but he thought some of it was loose. And Veer took a flashlight over and flashed it between his legs while he dug. There wasn't any more loose dirt than there is on the sidewalk out front, but he dug down there, and he dug up a pint bottle absolutely full of money. And I laughed. Veer dived in. He dived in after that money, and the fella fell back over Veer's shoulders just as though he was
tackled, huh?
He had been clipped.
Yeah.
And Veer came up with the money, and we brought him back. We offered to let him stay there all night if he wanted to, or bring him back to jail where it was warm. It was, I suppose, 10 below zero, and he decided he'd rather come back where it was warm. So he stayed in jail that night, and we convicted his wife, although he came in and testified for her and lied about it. And I told him beforehand, I got wind that he was going to lie about it. I said, you lie about it, there'll be a warrant there for perjury when you get off the stand. And there was, and so they both went at the same time. Later they were both killed in an explosion down at the powder plant west of Logansport. But they served their time, and it was, but the thing about it I still remember is when we got it all, and we'd finished up, Veer Howell looked at me, and he leaned over and he put his hand on my knee, and he said, John, you and I will get all the credit. And I said, Veer, I don't care who gets the credit. We got the dope, and forget the credit. That's and I worked very hard during the years I was prosecutor in getting the the three groups to work together, and I think we did help a great deal on that. I should say something about Frank Gertner while I'm on it, because he was Frank Gertner was the father of a professional police department in Wabash. He did more for the police department in Wabash than anybody we ever had. In spite of the fact that he had more faults as a police chief than anybody I ever knew, he was the greatest police chief I ever knew. He couldn't testify in court for sour apples. He would start out, well, now I'll tell you. And then, well, I'm not sure, but I think that was the way he always testified. It was the silliest thing you ever heard. And there were a great many ways that he was not a good chief. But in the things that counted, one thing that Frank had, which meant a great deal, he had the absolute confidence of the people. He could come down and walk around the block and he knew everything that had happened. People would tell him everything, and he never, if they said not to let it out who told him, he wouldn't. And lots of times I've had Frank say, I know who did that. All I got to do is get the evidence. I know. He'd been told, but he had to find some way to get the evidence to back it up. Well, that was one thing. Another thing, Frank, he was a bachelor. I think he had insomnia. He had an apartment up over the old Bradley Brothers drugstore down where the Gentry shop is now. But anytime, night or day, there was not a policeman in Wabash who could be sure that Frank wasn't looking around the corner and watched him. He had his eye on them all the time, and they knew that. It wasn't sneaky particularly either. They didn't feel that way about it, but Frank just knew what was going on at all times. And he did an enormous lot. He demanded that the city send them into every police school that came along. Wabash would have a man there to take the course and come back and report on it and train the others in what he had learned. And they did that over a period of years. And it was amazing the amount of training that the police force here got. Of course, Dudley Levengood was sent to the FBI school in Washington for that training. And others were sent, we had 2 or 3 who were trained to give a drunkometer. We had fingerprint experts. We had experts, and in a great many fields, these fellows were underpaid, but they had loyalty. They worked long hours. I don't know, they worked 65, 70 hours a week, and they were underpaid, but they did a job. And Frank instilled in them a pride in being policemen, and the morale of that department was terrifically high. And the thing that they hated, I think, worse than anything else was the idea of a crooked cop. They just, they were, I think I can say that without exception, there were some of them weren't so smart, but there were none of them that were dishonest. They were honest cops, every one of them, and doing the best they could. I remember one thing that amused me a little bit. This was during the war, and there was lots of talk about sabotage and that sort of thing. And one day, it was the day when there were 3 troop trains and a powder train going through on the Wabash Railroad, and a train came through ahead of them and noticed in the middle of the jackass curve between here and Lake Grove, which is the roughest curve on the whole Wabash Railroad, or the Wabash as it was then, noticed that the signals were in a way they could not possibly be without something being wrong. And they stopped the train and investigated and found the switch box had been shot out with 5 shots that were placed in a circle of not more than about 2.5 inches in diameter, right where they would do the most harm. And we had we had a swarm of FBI men, of state police, of everybody was in Wabash to try and solve that job. And Fred Ackerman, Fred was a local policeman here. He was one of the finest looking policemen I ever saw. Fred was not the smartest guy in the world. He would have been the first to admit that. He wasn't any brain. But he had some common sense, and he looked like an officer, and he was a good man. And Fred got to studying about it, and they found that those bullets had been put in by a .22 Hornet, which is a terrifically powerful gun. And they found that a red Ford had been seen up in that neighborhood. And Fred put them together, and he found a guy with a red Ford that had a Hornet and brought him in. Well, the poor guy, he'd gone out to shoot it at target. And that switch box, he put there was a place where he could tie a rock so that it was down in front of it, and he could use that as a target or something like that. Anyway, he shot it out, and I think he was perfectly innocent. Well, he paid big for it. The damages were $300. That'd be about like $1,500, $2,000 now, and he paid a big fine and suspended sentence and the whole works. But it always amused me that Fred Ackerman was the one that found it, not all the FBI boys that came to town. So that was another bit that I would mention. On learning things very early, I also learned never to trust a girl of 12, 13, 14 in that age when she accuses a man of molesting her in some way. Never believe her unless you have some outside evidence or something that would indicate that it happened. The thing that happened, Mary Adams worked on the welfare department. She was a very fine welfare worker, very fine woman. Later was the director of the welfare department, and a very good one. But this 12-year-old girl accused a married man, and a man with a decent reputation, of molesting her.
Well, we're not ready yet until I plug my mic in here. Okay.
All right. This little girl accused a man of a decent reputation here in town, young man, of having molested her. And Mary Adams, the welfare worker, was absolutely convinced that that had happened, and she brought the girl in. I questioned her, and she told all the details. She gave it exactly the way it happened, and I was convinced that she was telling the truth, and we filed the charges against this man. And of course, it came out on the front page that he was charged with molesting her. I'll never forget, I was there in the in the jail, in the office, when they brought that man in, and he turned to me and he said, "John, what would you do if you were me?" And I said, "Well, if I were you and I was guilty, I would say that I did it, and I would ask for lenience and do the best I could. But if I were you and I was not guilty, I'd fight it from hell to breakfast." And he insisted he wasn't guilty, and I talked to him a number of times and talked to the girl. And I began to wonder about it, and so finally I decided that we would send both of them to take a lie detector test. A lie detector is not, it's not infallible. It is right about, I think they say around 85 to 90% of the time. But you take two, and you're not likely to get the identical results in two and not be right. So we sent the two of them down to the state police laboratory at Indianapolis, where Bob Borkenstein, who has for a great many years now been professor at Indiana University, professor of criminology there, I think it is. But he was an expert with the lie detector, and he said the results were absolutely positive. The girl was lying and the man was telling the truth. And So we dismissed the charges. I went to Merritt Sills and I told him what had happened, and he gave it as much or more publicity than the original charge in order to do the best we could to restore the man's good name. But of course you can't do that. I mean, when a man has been charged that way, people don't forget it, and even though they know the facts, and there are always some of them who don't see the second story. So I felt very bad about it, and it happened that several years later, I expect it was about 8 years later, this same man, he'd gotten to drinking too much, and he kind of went bad. And he was arrested on a very legitimate charge of bootlegging. He was selling liquor on Sunday. And we brought him up, and I went to Merritt Sills, and I said, Merritt, you will remember the time when we did this man a grave injustice. I said, now, it is not comparable, but it seems to me we owe him everything we can give him, and I would like for this to stay out of the paper. There was never a thing in the paper about that. He paid his fine and went on. But I did learn from that never trust a young girl when she makes accusations against a man and things of that kind. There's something about it that fascinates these little girls, and they will do it time and time and again. And unless you have independent corroboration of some kind, don't file a charge on a man just because a 12, 13, 14-year-old says so. That isn't good. Now, another thing I learned was never to trust a bare confession. You may remember Tom Peabody at Manchester. He owned the Peabody Seating Company up there. He started it. And he was a multimillionaire, very fine man. And he had quite a collection of stamps. His stamp collection was valued in his estate at $50,000. But at one time, I think it was the Rotary Club, had a hobby show, and as a part of the hobby show, he made a small display of stamps, not worth anything, but it was put in the hobby show for people to look at, to show his hobby of stamp collecting. When he died, the newspaper carried quite an article about it, and something was said that he had a stamp collection worth $50,000. Well, now somebody got the idea that this little display of stamps that he'd fixed for the hobby show was the $50,000 stamp collection. And not long after he died, his office was broken into, and that stamp display was taken. They set fire to the office to try to cover it up. The fire was put out. It didn't get very far, but the stamps were gone. And we, almost immediately, the estate employed a very fine arson investigator from Chicago. I can't remember his name anymore. But the one thing I remember about him was that when he questioned somebody, he never forgot what they'd said. If you said one thing today and 2 or 3 days from now you said something which was a little different, he would call you on it right now. And he was good. We found a man. We found the man who did the actual stealing and set fire to the place. And he pleaded guilty. But he was an ignorant sort of fella, and we felt sure that he didn't do this on his own. And we questioned him about it. Yes, he said that a man had employed him to do it, had given him $20. I remember asking him what kind of bills he gave him. Was it a $20 bill? No, he gave him 2 10s. And he told us who it was. He gave us a lot more details, and we went up and we arrested this man and brought him down. The first day he was in jail, we questioned him 3 times for about 2 hours at a time. This arson investigator did practically all the questioning. He and Sterling Staver was the sheriff then. I was there. And he denied that he did it. And we had him 3 times, about 2 hours a time. Now, he wasn't under any third-degree situation as I would see it. He could smoke a cigarette when he wanted to smoke a cigarette. He could have a glass of water when he wanted a glass of water. He wasn't under any bright lights. Nobody touched him except maybe once in a while somebody would lean over and pat him on the leg and say, now look, maybe tell us this or... But we gave up that day and went back the next day, and we questioned him twice for about 2 hours each time. At the end of that time, he said he did it. And the arson investigator and Staver wanted to take him over immediately to have him plead guilty and send him to Michigan City. For some reason, as long as he said he didn't do it, I thought he did, but when he said he did do it, I began to wonder. And I said, no, we're not going to do that until he tells us how he did it, until he gives us the details. And I remember particularly, I asked him what kind of bills he gave, and he'd gotten the $20 from something. He said he gave a 10 and 2 5s. And he couldn't place the place where he gave it to him the same as the other fellow. And finally we brought them down face to face. And immediately you could tell that this man had nothing to do with it. And we took him back and released him, and it taught me a lesson. Never accept a bare statement that I did it. That doesn't mean a thing. If you've got to get how he did it, you've got to get the details that he couldn't know unless he did it. They tell me that in spectacular crimes, there are always quite a number of people come in. I did it. They want the publicity or something about it. But I learned it from that case that it just that's not the way to do it. Well, I held the office of prosecutor for 6 years, and then I decided I would leave the office of prosecutor and just practice law. And,
John, these were 2-year terms or 4?
Yes, 2-year terms.
Who was your opponent then the second time around?
I had no opponent the second time around.
No one ran in the primary against you?
No, and no Democrat ran. The second time around, a fella, his name was Smith. He was a printer, Red Smith. He wasn't a lawyer even. Ran on the prohibition ticket against me. That was the only opposition I had. And I don't believe I had any opposition in the third term. I may have. I just don't believe I did. But then I retired and went to practicing law, and Ward Vandergrift had come to town a short time before, and he ran for the office, and Ward had some troubles. Very spectacular thing. Asher Gray was county surveyor, and he was important in the Republican Party, and he got picked up for driving under the influence. And Ward prosecuted him, and frankly, he didn't have enough experience, and he was defeated in it, and there was a lot of outcry about that. Here was a man who was important in the Republican Party. Well, now I will assure you that Ward Vandergrift did the best he could. His best at that time was not good enough. But that got him out to a bad start, and Ward did not do well as a prosecutor. And a lot of people wanted me to come back and run again, and I finally did. And Ward ran, and Kenneth Bolton had come here then, and he ran. And I can't remember. There may have been a fourth one. At any rate, I won the election, and no opposition in the fall, and so I held it the fourth term after being out 2 years, and I've always regretted that I did, because I did not realize how much my private practice had increased. I didn't realize how much the prosecutor's work was increasing, because it was increasing greatly all of that time. And frankly, during those 2 years, I had too much to do to do it right. And I wished I'd called it quits at the end of 6 years. Might mention some of the attorneys.
John, excuse me, before we go on to the attorneys,
Yeah.
how about where was your office, and were you in practice with anyone? And
Originally, my office was over with Dad in the back of the Citizens Bank building. I was only here for 6 or 8 months when we bought the building, the first building south of the fire station, the City Hall. And Dad's office was in the front, and mine was directly back of that. And I was there. I stayed there until I went up to the judge's office. But we fixed it up rather nicely. And then when Ward Vandergrift came back, he came in with me.
With you?
Yeah. Yes, and he was practicing there. We weren't in partnership or anything, but we. And then Gene Wiesner's office was upstairs there. Gene, and when I first came back, Nelson Hunter, although Nelson left very early in the war and went down with Honeywell's first to, I always thought that was kind of to avoid the draft. I might, while we're on that, I might mention, I never understood how I did avoid the draft. I didn't try to avoid it. Of course, for quite a time, I was in what they called 3A because I had a family, and until I believe it was about January of '44, perhaps, they were not drafting men with families. Then in January, I was put in 1A, subject to examination, and Bob went in about a week later. He was in 1A, subject to examination. Now, I never did understand it, but Bob was called, went down, was examined, accepted. He asked for 90 days to arrange his work, which he got. About the 1st of April, he went into the Army. I had not been called yet, and it was sometime about the middle of April of that year that they decided they wouldn't take anybody over 35, and I had just turned 35, so they put me back, and I never was called, but I never did anything to avoid it, didn't do anything to get in either. I didn't think I was called on to volunteer. I might mention I did do what I thought was rather valuable work, and it wasn't pleasant work at all in the war effort. I was almost immediately, I was put on the ration board. The original 3 on the ration board were Bill Delaplane, who was then the county agent, and Veer Howell, the sheriff, and me. And we had to decide all these things about, and keep people from getting tires, keep people from getting gasoline, keep people from getting things that they needed, and needed very badly. And it was not pleasant. I'll never forget a man from Manchester who was a close friend of mine. I'd known him for years. And he came down, he needed tires to get to his work. And there wasn't any kidding about it. He had to have tires, and yet we had no tires. We couldn't even give the doctors tires to get out and see their patients. At that time, they went out to see patients. And I tried to explain that to him, and I'll never forget when he looked at me and said, if I was from Wabash, you'd give me tires. And that's not very pleasant. Later, we got quite a... when you try to run something of that kind, it always gets bigger and bigger. And we finally had quite an office down here. It's in a room. It's now would be a part of the bank's parking lot, just south of the bank there. Well, just south of the bank building was this little room where Jimmy Stephanoutis had his shoe store, and then the next building the ration board had, and Bruce Merritt was made he was the paid secretary, and the board got up to 9 people. I don't remember who all was on it anymore. Wilbur Ford, I know, was one of them, and frankly, they were pretty big men in Wabash. I kind of felt I was almost out of my class in that group. I remember one incident that happened over there that Ralph Dalton was originally a painter. He was known as the drunken painter because he imbibed far too freely. But during the war, he became a termite exterminator. Now, Wabash was noted for tree trimmers and termite exterminators. They were biggest crooks in the world. And yet the ration regulations placed termite exterminators right up with doctors as far as tires and gasoline were concerned. It was a big deal here. So Dalton came down to the ration board to get tires as a termite exterminator. And well, it was easy because we didn't even have tires for the doctor, and I'll guarantee you that Ralph Dalton wasn't going to get any tires for a doctor. But he shouted and yelled at us and called us names and everything. And I'll never forget when he finally walked out, Bill Delaplane looked around the group. I think he was president of the board. If he wasn't, he should have been, because he was a wonderful man on it. But Bill looked around at the rest of us and he said, you know, I'm an easy man. I can be talked out of most anything. But I'll be goddamned if they're going to bulldoze me out of it. But I always had a great respect for Bill Delaplane from that experience. I have never known a man like him. When people would come in to get tires or gasoline or whatnot, and he had none to give them, Bill listened to their story, and then he'd tell his story, and first he'd cry on their shoulder, and then he'd have them crying on his shoulder. And when they got through, they'd leave without whatever they came for, feeling sorry for Bill Delaplane. Well, now that is an accomplishment. And I said many times that Bill could send them away happier not giving them what they want than I could send them away if I was able to give them what they wanted. It was not a very pleasant job, and I was glad when that was over. You mentioned about my children. Perhaps this would be a good.
Did you want to intersperse that, or the attorneys that?
Yes, I wanted to tell about the attorneys. Some of them, of course, Frank and Howard Plummer were the two outstanding attorneys in Wabash when I started. It was early in '42 that Walter Bent became judge when Byron Kennedy went to the Navy right after the war started, and he recommended Walter, and Governor Schricker appointed him as the judge. Young Al Plummer, that's young Al, Al Plummer, the father of the young Al today, was in with his father and uncle, although he went to the Navy too very shortly, had a very distinguished war record, an outstanding young attorney. Herb Bent was here. Before too long, he went with the rent control, went to Washington and then out to Los Angeles with them. As a prosecutor, the most common defense attorneys, Walter Bixler from Peru was he would be the one you'd have to call the hot shot defense counsel. Walter made a wonderful appearance as a defense lawyer. He had one of the most beautiful voices I have ever heard, and frankly, I thought that was about it. And it seemed to me that he gave the same final argument in every case that he ever tried, a very nice sounding oration, and he had it worked out very well. I met him time and again. He was defense counsel, and I never lost a case to Walter. Herman Hipskind was an outstanding lawyer as far as capabilities was concerned. Herman was a great lawyer. He had no ethics whatever. He was, the stories of Herman and the women were legion. Herman was not above anything as far as honesty or morals were concerned. They did not affect his work at all. He did not consider those things of any importance. But he was a good lawyer. He was, I mean, from the standpoint of being technically good. And I always felt that I felt very pleased with the batting average I had against Herman. Now, he beat me sometime, but not very often. The third one that I met all the time was Joe Murphy. Now, everybody spoke of poor old Joe. Joe was blind, or almost blind. He could get, he could read if he could get things up within 3 or 4 inches of his eyes. And he always seemed to be bumbling around. And yet, for some reason or other, he won cases. And he defeated me far more often than any other defense counsel I had. I always kind of figured it this way. Juries, of course, they look at Herman Hipskin and they know he was good. And I think they figured that if Herman made it sound as though it had rate about number 5 up, they cut it back down to about 3 on the base of the last 2. Herman raised it that much because of his abilities. And I think that if Joe made it look like it was about 2 up, they raised it up to 4 because they thought it must be better than Joe could make it look. Yeah. But Joe won an awful lot of cases, and I still have a lot of respect for Joe. He's past it now, and he's well past 72 years old, but for a man who had the handicap which he started out with, which he's had all his life, Joe Murphy did very, very well, and he would have done a great deal better if he had only learned that in criminal cases particularly, you get your money before you do the work, because you'll never get it afterward. And if Joe were paid all that he's earned, he'd be a wealthy man today, but he would go ahead on the basis, well, they'll pay me later, and they never did pay him later.
Shall we change tape, John, I think, rather than run over another story?
Attorneys that at that time, of course, the 2 Smiths, Bob and George, were not trained lawyers. They were rough and tumble lawyers. George had worked at the clerk's office for many years, and that's where he learned all the law he knew. I think Bob perhaps went to Notre Dame Law School for 1 year and busted out. I gathered that. I might be quite wrong, and maybe I'm libeling him by saying that. But he was a good man, and they did good work. Gene Wiesner was a very fine lawyer. He was a brilliant man, over-technical. He was always highly technical in everything, and had a rather cold brain, I thought, but I liked Gene very much, and Gene was a good lawyer. And Ken Bolton came, and Ken was a little fella. He looked. He always reminded me of Joe Feeney on Lawrence Welk's show. They looked a great deal alike, but Bolton he had the makings of a good lawyer, but he quit too early. He had been making a great deal of money with the Dale Carnegie courses, and he couldn't see that he might do better if he stayed with the law, and he went back to Dale Carnegie, and maybe he did do better. He made a lot of money at it, I know, but anyway, he quit the law and went away. Then it was, then let's see, what was the guy's name came up here from Indianapolis with Don Mote? little fellow that worked for the Attorney General for a long time, and I can't think of his name now. I can look it up and find out. He was here for 5 or 6 years, I think, and that would take us up to about the time when, Lynn Ford and Bob Bostwick came about the time I got out of the prosecutor's office. Well, Lynn had been with the FBI, and he came here, and Bob came shortly thereafter. Well, those were most of the attorneys during that period. Well, perhaps it might be wise to go back and pick up on the two children. And
before we go that, were you ever bribed or anything, John? I don't think we've ever.
Well, I think I told about Herman Hipskin trying to bribe me.
I think you and I had that in a private conversation, but I don't think we put that on tape.
Didn't I tell?
No, I don't think we put that.
Well, we should put that in right now
you
because
had 2 bribes offers.
Yes, the first. When I called the grand jury to indict Mosey Harrell for killing Ostheimer, I also presented the evidence that Herman Hipskin had tried to bribe me. I don't know yet whether I was more angry at the fact that he tried to bribe me or at the amount. He offered me $50 if I would recommend a suspended sentence for a client of his, and I wangled it so that he made the offer a second time in front of my brother Bob, so that I had some corroborative evidence, and he was indicted for that, and I guess it worried him quite a bit. However, it was Frank Plummer represented him, and Frank made a motion to dismiss on the ground that the bribery is defined as offering money to influence a man in his official duties. And Frank's argument was that it was not an official duty of the prosecutor to make a recommendation of sentence, and therefore there had not been bribery. In lieu of today's plea bargaining, I think that would be an interesting thing to suggest today. At any rate, at that time, that was while Walter Bent was ill, and Judge McNagny of Columbia City was Judge Pro Tem. He had just left the job as judge at Columbia City, and he followed Frank's argument and dismissed the case against Mr. Hipskin. And while I felt that we could have won it on an appeal and gone ahead with it, I had accomplished everything I wanted to accomplish. I let everybody know that I wasn't for sale, and so I let it go at that. And I've only had the one offer since. I haven't been fortunate in a number of offers of bribes. An attorney from down at Centralia, Illinois, was here representing a criminal one time, and he sat in my office all evening making very thinly veiled offers, which I was too dumb to recognize, and I had a lot of fun listening to him make these offers, and I didn't recognize that he was wanting to give me money. But no, I have not been bothered with any bribes other than that. So,
good.
Anything else before we?
No, we'll come back to the law on that when we go into that, but let's go on to the family now and the children.
Well, my first child was Patricia Ann, whom we soon nicknamed Tad because she wiggled so much we started calling her the Tadpole. She was born back in Kokomo in 1933. As a matter of fact, she was born so soon after we got married that all the old days were counting on their fingers. She was born October 25th, and we had been married on Christmas, which was exactly 10 months before. But one thing I learned very quickly, or we learned with Tad, we learned they're never too young to learn discipline. I think she was not over 3 months old when she put on a mad tantrum one day, and Ruby just wheeled her over in the corner, facing into the corner, and she was in her baby buggy, and left her there until she quit crying, and then wheeled her back out again. The next day, she started to do exactly the same thing, and Ruby started to wheel her into the corner, and she quit crying right now and was wheeled back, and it didn't. She learned her lesson very quickly. Perhaps she learned it too well. If my criticism of Tad in her growing up were two, and both of them were really that she was, one of them was she was too good. She was too interested in doing the things that we wanted her to do always. And I think sometimes she thought in terms not of what she wanted to do, but of what she thought we would want her to do. That was always one of her weaknesses. I don't know whether to call it a fault or not, but it was a weakness. The other was that she developed a very strong inferiority complex, which was too bad. She was, I don't know why inferiority complexes always strike people shouldn't have them. Her mother was that way too, and it's something we fought against all her life to try and get her over her complex. And Tad's had the same thing, although I think Tad has gotten over it much better than her mother. I remember when we went out to Boston, we'd drive out there, and very early she developed an affinity for car sickness. And every time we'd drive anywhere, she'd get sick, and I'd feel so sorry for her. We'd get in that old Model A Ford and drive to Cambridge or back from Cambridge, and she would get sick, and many times we'd just hold her out the window and let her throw it out and keep on going because we couldn't stop for her all the time. But Tad was, she was a very pretty youngster, and she attracted a great deal of attention. She, I remember one time we were driving back and we put her up behind the seat in that Ford coupe. There was room up behind the seat, and everybody who passed us, and almost everybody did pass us because we drove at 45 miles an hour, which was wide open for us. But everybody was making great note of Tad sitting up behind there playing and that sort of thing. But I know that if Tad had been in school, we would not have put her in school in Cambridge or Boston, because the city schools, there were a couple of teachers lived next door to us there, and their stories of it were rather horrifying to us. And if she had been old enough to go to school, we would have left her with her grandmother to go. But we came back to Indianapolis when we graduated. Before I graduated from law school, we realized if we were going to have any more children, it was high time that we got at it, because Tad was well past 6 years old when we. No, I'm getting mixed up on that. She was almost 6 years old when we graduated from law school. And so when we went to Indianapolis, Cookie was on the way, and I remember one of the things we laughed about when we were in Indianapolis. There was no more bakery man came house to house selling bread, cakes, and so forth. And Ruby got a feeling that above everything else she would like to have some gooseberry pie. And every time he came, she asked if he had a gooseberry pie, and he never did, of course, until I think he went back to the bakery and said, "Look, you've got to fix a gooseberry pie for this woman. She's pregnant. She thinks she has to have a gooseberry pie." Anyway, one morning, he came up the sidewalk, I guess, with a big grin all over his face, holding this gooseberry pie, which Ruby proceeded to eat all of it. But at any rate, rather unfortunate thing, when Cookie was born, I had been sent down to Warwick County at Boonville, down on the, right close to the Ohio River, west of Evansville, to clear up some titles of land, and I was hurrying to get it done. And one night at about 2 o'clock, I got a telephone call, and it was Ruby, and she said the doctor said it'd be not more than 24 hours. Well, I had one quitclaim deed to get, and I would be through, and I was supposed to meet the man at 8:30 in the morning, and I thought I could get through in time to catch the morning bus. And so the old man who went with me, he was a little late that morning, and then we drove out. Well, you don't walk into somebody and say, sign this quitclaim deed, I'm in a hurry. You got to talk about the pigs and the chickens a little bit, and that went on, and finally I got it signed and got back to town, missed the bus by 5 minutes. I spent all day in the courtroom watching a murder trial and caught the bus at 5 o'clock that evening, got home about midnight, and Cookie had been born at 10:30 that morning. So I didn't see her till she was 24 hours old. And but no, her name was Beverly Kay. I don't know where she got the nickname Cookie. It was Ruby's idea, but it was before Cookie and Dagwood anyway. I don't know where she got it, but it was always Cookie. Cookie was quite different from Tad. She was much more rebellious all of her life than Tad, without being particularly bad about it. Cookie was a good girl, but she had quite a temper, and I don't think it was unusual that, being 6.5 years younger than Tad, she had a tendency to feel that Tad got the best of everything, as most younger ones do. But, I don't know, they grew up very normally. One little story I always got a kick out of, when Cookie was about 4 or 5 years old, John Lavelle was the manager of the Eagles Theater. And John was a young fellow, a very nice boy. He later became a priest. And he always took a particular interest in Cookie. And one evening we went to the movie, and after the movie we went to Pontius Drugstore, which was in the corner there of the theater building. And John came in, and we were having some malted milks or something of the kind, and John was talking to Cookie. And all at once he said, "Cookie, what is your real name?" And Cookie looked up. She said, why? She turned to her mother. She said, "Mama, what is my name?" She couldn't remember it herself. They both went to the West Ward to school. Cookie graduated in the last class in the old West Ward building there on Maple and Fisher Streets. It was quite an old building. I always felt bad when it was gone, because Jim Weiss's daughter, Jean, and another girl had painted the kindergarten room in there. They had put circus pictures around the wall with the people in it were all high school students and so forth. I thought it was beautifully done. It made a wonderful kindergarten room, and it was too bad that only got to last for 2 or 3, 4 years. Now, Cookie, one thing I remember in Cookie, both of the girls were good students. There was, but when Cookie was I believe it was not more than her second year in school, they studied about Mount Vernon and George Washington, and about that time, I think of spring vacation, we went to Washington. By that time, my older brother, George, was in Washington, and we went out to see them, and Cookie was very anxious to go to Mount Vernon, so we took her down there, and we let her stay as long as she wanted. We were there for, I expect 2 hours and a half or so, and she really looked the place over. now you go there and they hurry you through. You don't really get to see anything hardly, comparatively. But when we came back, a few days later, our teacher called Ruby and she said, Ruby, do you know what that girl did? She said, she wanted to tell about Mount Vernon, and we told her she could have as much time as she wanted, and she talked for 50 straight minutes in the second grade about Mount Vernon. So Cookie had learned something. We tried insofar as we could to keep the girls under control and yet at the same time to push them out of the nest. I remember when Cookie was about 11 years old, her Aunt Catherine in Washington suggested that Cookie and some of her friends come to Washington to see them. And they must have been 11 or 12 because they saved their money. Cookie made it babysitting, but they saved their money, and I think 4 of them paid for their own tickets to fly from Indianapolis to Washington, and Ritter Lavengood and I took them down, put them on the plane in Indianapolis. Of course, the plane didn't stop till it got to Washington, and her Aunt Catherine met her as she came down the steps of the plane, but they went by themselves, and it did a great deal for their self-confidence that they had gone to Washington all by themselves. But neither of the girls were particularly popular in high school. And I don't think either one of them was particularly happy in high school. It's awfully hard to tell a high school kid that your time will come later, but so many times the ones who are very popular in high school, that is the only time they ever have. It seems that way to me. One thing Ruby always insisted on with the girls, and I think it was good, they never were allowed to go anywhere that, if they went one place, if they were going to go to another place, they would telephone us and tell us they were going to the other place, not so that we could say yes or no. I don't know of any time that they were ever refused to go someplace else. But we explained it, that if we needed to get hold of them in a hurry for something, why, they should let us know. And they seemed to understand that, and they went along with it. Well, our one thing I think made a great deal of difference in their lives, when Cookie was 8 years old and Tad would have been 14 then, we started traveling. That year in 48, we took 3 weeks to go through the Northwest, and then down to Los Angeles to a Kiwanis convention, and then back up through the Northwest again and home. And the girls seemed to enjoy it. Now they enjoyed different things from what Ruby and I enjoyed, but they always enjoyed traveling. And we started out then very consciously to see that the girls got into all of the then 48 states, which they did. And they got into the 48 states. They got just into Mexico, over to Juarez, I think. They were over quite a bit of eastern Canada. And then about 1951, a thing, Phil Eskew was principal at the high school. We used to play bridge together on Saturday night, and he told a story which affected me and affected our lives somewhat after that. He told how Bromley, who had the Chevrolet garage, had called him one time to go down and talk to him one evening. And Bromley said that all of his life he had had a goal. He wanted to make so much money, and when he made that, he was going to retire, and then he and his wife were going to travel. They were going to go all the places, do all the things they'd always wanted to do. And he wanted Phil to come down and work for him, and then when he retired to take over the business and run it for him. Which Phil, of course, refused to do, but Phil wound it up by saying that was just 30 days before Bromley dropped over dead. And of course, Mrs. Bromley, after that, went quite a few places, did quite a few things with other men. I don't mean to criticize her. She was a very lovely lady. But I got to thinking that if we, and the Beauchamps have always been traveling people, I got to thinking that if we were ever going to travel, we ought to start doing it. Now, in 1952, we went to a Kiwanis convention. I was the lieutenant governor of this division of Kiwanis that year, and so it was expected that I would go to Seattle to the convention. And three of us from this division, Clint Barnes had been the district governor, the Indiana governor of Kiwanis, and Bill Didier from Fort Wayne, they and their wives, and Ruby and me, all took a boat up through the Interpassage to Alaska that year, and we had quite a time there. And by the way, Ruby and I drove out. We went up to International Falls, north to Kenora, and then straight west from Kenora until we got to Banff and Lake Louise, and then we did go down into the States because it was very difficult to get across British Columbia at the time. But we had a lot of fun on that trip. But we started, even before then, we started saving money for a European trip. And for 3 years, we planned that trip. We read every book we could get on how to do it cheaper and what to do and what to see and things of that kind. And we had a wonderful 3 years planning the trip. And in 1954, we went to, we flew first to Shannon, Ireland, took a train across Ireland. Well, we took a taxi, which took us around Killarney and Barney Castle and down to Cork, and the next day we took a train across to Dublin, and then we were in Dublin all afternoon looking at things, and then took the boat and train from Dublin across to Holyhead, and then from Holyhead to London. And I had a car purchased in London, and we drove all over England, and then we went we went through Belgium and Luxembourg and Holland and over through northern Germany up to Denmark and Sweden and Norway and back down through Germany and Switzerland and Liechtenstein and Austria and Italy and back up to Paris. We had 10 weeks in Europe that summer. Bought a little English, well, it wasn't the little English Ford, it was the middle-sized English Ford, which would be very small here now. I would judge about the size of the Opel today, but it was very good for the four of us. It would seat 6 actually, and it was a good little car. I brought it home and had a lot of fun with it. Kept it for about 6 years before I got rid of it. No, I kept it 5 years because I sold it when we went back to Europe. But anyway, we drove 10,600 miles. When I came home, I was writing to 17 different families in Europe that I had met. And that's always been a hobby of mine ever since, to know people in different parts of the world and to understand them, to get letters from them, to know what they're thinking about things. It's always seemed to me one of the most important lessons we can learn is that people are all alike. It doesn't matter where they come from. It doesn't matter what religion they have. It doesn't matter what kind of a culture they have been in. In the things that count, we are all exactly the same. It's odd to me. You take a Japanese, for example, who's in his whole background, his whole culture is so very different from us, and yet we have had jokes with Japanese that we couldn't talk to at all. But they understand the joke. We laugh at the same things. I just got a letter today from a young Japanese that I remember when we first met him, he couldn't speak English, and we still had a lot of fun with him, and he still spells John J-H-O-N, but well, it was that first trip, by the way, that Dick Johnston came to me before he had worked for Sears, he was farming then. He came to me and told me about a fellow in Germany that he had known during the war. He was a Romanian. His name was Joe Schneider, and Joe had a visa to come to the United States, and he wanted me to go and see him. Gave me his address in Mosbach, Germany.
Okay, we were talking about Joe Schneider.
Well, Dick gave me Joe's address. He gave me a letterhead. Joe was running a garage in Mosbach, Germany, about 50 miles west of Heidelberg, up the Neckar River. And so we came through Mosbach, and I went to a filling station, and I showed them the letterhead, and they understood. I couldn't talk to them. They understood I wanted to find Joe Schneider. And the man running the filling station called a young fellow, and he got on a motorcycle and motioned for us to follow him, and he took us to Joe's home, and his wife Liba was there. She couldn't speak any English, but she called Joe, and before very long Joe came, and he brought a young fellow named Mertz, who was a good interpreter. And we sat and talked all afternoon, and then we wound up by going to Mertz, what do they call it, his tavern, which was very old. It was back behind the church, and it had a wine cellar. The cellar was built in 750 A.D., and he was quite proud of that. But anyway, we went down there, and we sat at a table there talking, and people came in, and they all gathered around. They kept adding to this table, so we had 12 or 15 people at the table, and we were drawing pictures and everything else, and Mertz was interpreting as much as possible, and never have had more fun. The Germans have a way, particularly when they're poor, as they were then, of spending a lot of time in the tavern without drinking very much, and nobody had too much to drink. I don't think anybody had over 3 or 4 beers in the whole evening. I remember one thing. Joe was, he wanted, Joe had found by that time, originally he thought he could say, he had his visa to come here, and he had thought that he could sell his stuff for enough to pay the fare to get himself and his family. He had 4 children, to get them over here. By that time he had found the facts of life, that when you have to sell, nobody's going to pay much. And he asked me if I would get Dick Johnston to loan him $400 to come. Well, it put me in a bad spot, and I said, I don't know. Dick is not a wealthy man. He doesn't have much money. I don't know whether he can or not, but I will write to him. Well, we were over there until 2 o'clock in the morning, had a wonderful time. Next morning we got up, and it was a Sunday morning. We drove into Heidelberg and tried to find Gene Wiesner's boy, Tom, who was stationed at Heidelberg at the time, but he was out on maneuvers somewhere. I was interested in the fact that the military police and the Heidelberg police had the same quite large office, but they had There was a desk, and in the middle it was divided, and the German police on one side and the American police on the other, and I was amazed at the cooperation between them. They were working together very beautifully, and I was glad to see that. Well, anyway, we drove down through the Black Forest that day, and we got to Freiburg, and I wrote a letter to Dick Johnston and told him about meeting Joe, and told him that Joe needed $400 to get to the United States. And I signed the letter, but for some reason I didn't seal it up. I left it lying in the room, and we went down to eat, and I came back and I got to thinking about it, and I put a P.S. on it. I said, Dick, if you can get $250, I'll put in the other $150. And frankly, that postscript was the reason Joe Schneider got to the United States. Dick had no money. But he said when he got it, he got to thinking, now, John's seen the man. I can go to people and say, look, here's the letter I have from John. And he did. And he went to 5 or 6 different fellows, put money in, and before it got through, it was 600 instead of 4. I put in the 200, and the others put it in, and so Joe and his family got over here in October of that year, and none of them could speak a word of English, and Dick got Joe a job on a farm down on the prairie for Hoke, and what's his first name? I can't think. Delbert Hoke. And they furnished him a very poor house, and I think he got some milk and meat perhaps, and $35 a week. And he started out regularly $10 a week. He paid on that $600. I never quite forgot that. I told him, I said, look, Joe, leave me till the last. I don't have to be paid that quick. I came to have very high regard for Joe. Joe always gave me a lot more credit than I deserved, I think. I never gave him anything. I loaned him money, which he paid back usually very quickly. I did do this. I gave them friendship when they needed it. I've gone down there many times, and we've struggled to make each other understand when neither one could speak the other's language. And it wasn't always easy. But those were times I think meant something to them. And, of course, Joe, since then, as you know, has been one of my very good friends. And after 2 or 3 months on the farm, he learned enough English that he was an expert mechanic, and he went to... Dick got him a job at Pruitt International Harvester as a mechanic, and then we fixed it for him to work for Jack Cross. Later he went to General Tire, and now he's teaching at the vocational school. They say he's one of the best teachers they have, even though his accent is terrible, and sometimes he can't think of a word, but he knows how to teach. I've always been very proud of anything that I had to do in bringing Joe Schneider to Wabash. Well, I suppose that brings us up to pretty much to 1956, when Byron Kennedy decided to retire as judge. Byron had been a very popular judge. Now, Walter Bent took over in 1942, and the judge, when he's appointed, he serves until the very next election. You run for judge, you see. So Walter served as judge until the next election, and then he ran and was elected judge for 6 years. He ran in 1942 and was and stayed in for 6 years until January 49. Byron Kennedy was unhappy. He felt that as soon as he came back from the Navy, that Walter should resign and let him be reappointed. But Walter didn't feel that way about it. He felt he'd been elected for 6 years, and he served the 6 years. But Byron then, of course, was elected. He ran. Nobody ran against him. But in early in '56, he decided to leave the bench and go into practice with the Rock Hill firm at Warsaw. And so he resigned, and there was there were three were very active in trying to get the appointment. Gene Wiesner, who had been prosecutor 4 years, and the one from the Attorney General's office was Don Mote, and why I can't remember his name, I don't know, and me, the three of us were after the appointment, and I thought at one time I had it sewed up because the governor asked for a committee to investigate and make recommendations. They recommended me, and I thought I would get it, but he chose Gene, and Gene was appointed and served the rest of the year, and then, of course, four of us ran in the primary. Gene and the man from the Attorney General's office, Eldon Wright, and I.
We'll get that when
We'll get that.
assignment, yeah.
Yeah. And at any rate, I figured, and rightly so, that Gene was my competition. Fortunately, up at Manchester, they thought Eldon Wright was my competition, and I never told anybody different. And at that time, they were all paper ballots. They came in slowly, and I called about 9 o'clock, and was the time I'd call when the first precinct had come in, and it was always precinct 4, which was down the library precinct, a very small precinct, by the way, and that's why it came in first. I'd never lost precinct 4, and I never forget that evening I called, and I was losing at 36-24. So I was losing right-handedly for that, and but I told Ruby I will not concede until we get 1 or 2 precincts out of Manchester, because I always had the advantage in an election that while I lived in Wabash, I was a Wabash boy to everybody here, yet I'd gone through college at Manchester. Ruby was from Manchester. Her mother lived in Manchester. Her brother lived in Manchester. George had taught in Manchester College for 14 years. And so in many ways, they thought of me as a Manchester boy. Well, I remember one bit about that. Ruby had been going to the county farm once a week to work with the old people out there, and we felt sure that all the old people would vote for me if we got them to the polls. So we went out to see if they got to the polls. Well, Russell Jones brought the school bus over and took them to they voted at Chippewa. There were 31 of them. And when the votes were counted in the Chippewa precinct, I won by 31 votes. I said, I got the senility vote anyway. But it was neck and neck until we got, perhaps I was some ahead. And the first precinct came in from Manchester, and I had 280 votes, and Eldon Wright had 75, and Gene had 14, and that was the end of that. I had made it. And by the way, on that senility vote, I also remember the first time I ran for prosecutor, Freddie Vinson was our local half-wit. Freddie was a nice boy. He was badly retarded. But I took him up he wanted to go and vote, and I took him up. He voted at the Adams House on West Hill Street. I'll never forget, I took him up there, and he went in to vote, and I'm sure Freddie intended to vote for me. I don't know whether he did or not. I don't know whether he could make it or not.
Well, I was leaning up against the side of the car while Freddie went in to vote, and suddenly it occurred to me, his vote's just as good as mine. Well, anyway, Gene was judge until the first of the year, and then I took over. I found out later that the thing which I had thought had been so, I had been so very disappointed that I didn't get the appointment. I found out later that was one of the finest things that happened to me, because Byron Kennedy had been an extremely popular judge with the attorneys, with the general public, with everybody. And when Gene Wiesner went in, he was following Byron Kennedy, and nobody was satisfied with Gene. And Gene soon found out that he did not like the bench at all. And he was tickled to death that he only had it till the end of the year. But when I took over, you see, instead of being compared with Byron Kennedy, I was compared with Gene Wiesner. And Gene had not been popular as a judge, and so I was kind of in the catbird seat.
John, what were you doing for finances and that, or did it take much money in those days?
To run?
Yes.
Oh, it's never taken a lot of money to run in Wabash County. It takes a lot of legwork. You try to see an enormous lot of people when you buy some. At that time, we bought matches to give away and put some ads in the newspapers. $200 would be quite a bit to spend in a campaign. So nobody gave you any. I'll tell you that. You paid it right out of your own little pocket.
Were you expected to support the Central Committee in that financially, or
Oh,
not?
yes. I didn't count what you would donate to them. They pretty well told you how much it'd be, and I don't remember. I think a candidate, well, you got nicked in the spring and fall both, and I don't remember the amount anymore. It'd be larger in the fall than in the spring, although you were primarily interested in the spring and not the fall. But after all, there's no use. There's no use complaining about paying into the party, because in our system, you don't get anywhere on your own. You've got to go along with the party, and the party. It's of sufficient importance to you that you darn well owe all that they ask you to pay. They don't ask great big amounts or anything. I think my guess would be that for the judge back in those days, it was perhaps $150 in the fall and $50 in the spring, something like that. Doesn't break you up. It's you pay it. But going into the judge's office, the finest thing that happened to me was having Mabel Gray as the court reporter. Mabel Gray had started reporting when I was 1 year old. At that time, she was about 60 years old. She was the best reporter in the state. I don't think there's any question about that. She could take the proceedings down. If 2 or 3 people got to arguing, she could get it for about a minute. And then she'd throw up her hands and say, "Gentlemen," and that means you're off the record. We're done. But as far as the regular proceedings, she never missed anything. It was absolutely there. She knew everything about the work. She, to a new judge, she was invaluable. Her advice about things as to the way to do things. Now, she never tried to tell you how to decide a case or anything of that kind, but as to the procedure and so forth, it was a wonderful thing to have somebody like Mabel. And of course, another thing, Mabel Gray was one of the finest women I've ever known, one of the finest conversationalists I've ever known. She was simply ideal for that, and that was a great deal of help.
Was she fast and accurate at the same time?
Yes, extremely fast and extremely accurate. She had had some tremendous jobs in her time. She started as a court reporter when she was 18 years old at Seymour. She was there for some time. Now, I don't remember the order of things. At one time, she was secretary to Will Hayes, who later became the czar of the movies. He lived at Sullivan. And Will Jr. was the mayor of Crawfordsville, and we used to go, the judges used to go down there, and I spoke to him, told him that Mabel was my court reporter, and he said he remembers so well when he was just a little fella. And I told her about it. She said, I've changed his diaper lots of times. And Judge Lewis from Seymour, she said the same thing about him. She babysat with Judge Lewis when he was a baby. Then she was head of the, secretary of the industrial board in Indianapolis. She was the head of the secretarial staff of a large Chicago law firm. Then she was with the criminal court in Gary. How it happened, I don't know, but she came to Peru and was Hurst's court reporter when he was judge, and then she came here with Byron Kennedy. But she had had lots of experience, and I was tickled to death. She stayed on until I think she was 78 when she retired. Her hearing began to go bad. She lost some of her speed, and we got the recording equipment. 2 years earlier, she had sneered at the idea of using recording equipment, but by that time she felt that it kept her on for 2 or 3 years longer. Mm-hmm. And so I felt very happy about that. One of the first things as judge, of course, you always meet some things that are unhappy. Al Plummer, who was a very good attorney, the first 5 items that he had before me, he lost every one of them. And boy, oh boy, was he mad at me. And he told me off, and there's no use arguing with him. I told Mabel, well, I don't judge attorneys, I judge cases, and Al's going to win his share. He'll have some good ones, but so far he's had some stinking poor ones, too. I think the one thing you have to do, that is the thing you have to do, is to consider the cases. If you try to judge attorneys, you're done. Now, when I started in, there were a couple of the old attorneys, the old real fine attorneys, Russell Wildman from Peru, and
Bangs from Huntington, would he be?
No, he was not one of these, but Bangs did. He was one of the old fire horses. But the man Ezra Graham from Warsaw, both of them, in a very kind of an underhanded method, would suggest, you find against me, young man, I'll appeal and I'll get you reversed. And I remember Wildman, he didn't say it exactly that way or that openly, but that was the general idea. And I said, Mr. Wildman, let me suggest this to you. You may be able to reverse me on this. That is immaterial to me, whether I'm reversed or not. I am here to try to do what I think is the right thing and what I think is according to law. And if the appellate court wants to reverse me, that's their business and not mine. And I never had, Russell never made any more threats of that kind at all. And I think that is the way you have to figure. You do the best you can, and you try to decide it according to what you think's right, not according to which attorney you think can get you reversed or can't get you reversed. And usually you get along all right. I've been rather proud of the fact that I have been reversed 4 times in 18 years. One of those I rather expected to be reversed. It was a criminal case, and yet I was sure that factually I was right. Legally I was wrong, and I knew it. But I felt that the man should go free, and I found him not guilty, and they reversed me on it, but he was still free. The other 3 cases were all exactly the same thing. They were what we call summary judgments, in which they state what the facts are, and I have to decide if I can grant judgment only if I find there is no argument about it, whatever. And both cases, or in all 3 cases, the appellate court found there was some wild-eyed theory on which the other side might have won, which was never presented to me, whatever. And those are the only ones I've been reversed on, so I felt real good about it. I think I've made, from that standpoint, an unusually good record, because there are very few that don't get reversed at least once, twice a year.
Well, go ahead.
But I will say this, that on the whole, I think I'm probably the most fortunate man in the world, because I set my goal to be the judge of the Wabash Circuit Court. And in so many cases, a man sets a goal like that, and then he gets it, and he finds he doesn't like it nearly as well as he thought he would.
But you liked it.
I have liked every minute of it.
I'm going to close this part 20, John.
Okay.